Picture this, a dim hallway, the kind where every footstep sounds like a secret trying to wake up. In that breathless stillness, something shifts inside you, something ancient, something Steiner warned about long before modern psychology even had a name for it. He said the real fracture in human consciousness begins the moment the heart tries to think and the mind begins to feel, not because it's poetic, but because it's dangerous, very dangerous. Neuroscientists now estimate that nearly 80% of people live in a state of emotional disorientation, unable to tell whether their fears come from instinct or from a mind that has turned into a trembling animal. Steiner predicted this long before brain scans existed. He called it the silent inversion, a forbidden moment in which the inner architecture of the human being begins to collapse. Imagine waking in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone has rearranged your thoughts without your permission. That's how this phenomenon begins, quietly, like a shadow learning your name. The heart, which should be the center of warmth and courage, starts to create logic, cold, obsessive logic, while the mind, which should remain sharp and observant, floods with emotions that don't belong to it. You think something is wrong with your mood, but what's actually happening is a shift in the spiritual mechanics of your being. Steiner said that this inversion opens a door to forces we don't understand, forces that thrive in the cracks between emotion and thought. He warned that if the door stays open for too long, the human being loses his own center, becoming a puppet of impulses that whisper from the dark corners of the soul. Jung once described a patient who embodied this phenomenon with terrifying clarity. A man in his 40s, pale, exhausted, with a voice that sounded like it was being borrowed from someone long dead. Every time he sat in the leather chair of Jung's office, the air dropped a few degrees. He said he could hear his thoughts beating inside his chest like a second heart. And worse, he felt emotions bloom inside his skull, grief, rage, longing, none of which belonged to any real memory. He told Jung that sometimes his mind cried at night with a voice much younger than his own, as if a forgotten child lived behind his eyes. Jung wrote that the man's gaze was like a candle flickering inside a cavern, on the edge of being blown out at any moment. Modern research actually supports this eerie crossover. Studies from Harvard and Stanford show that emotional signals from the heart influence cognition far more than science once believed. Electrical impulses travel not only downward into the body, but upward into the brain, shaping perception before the conscious mind even notices. In other words, Steiner wasn't being mystical, he was being accurate. He insisted that human consciousness is not a machine, but a battlefield where invisible forces collide. When the heart begins to think, it takes on burdens it was never meant to carry. When the mind begins to feel, it absorbs wounds it cannot heal. And in that confusion, the self becomes fragmented. Ancient traditions understood this better than we do today. Tibetan monks described the heart as the throne of awareness, while Greek philosophers called it the eye of the soul. Early Christian mystics believed that when the heart feels thoughts and the mind feels wounds, demons slip in through the cracks. They weren't talking about literal monsters, but psychological predators. Fear, resentment, self-betrayal, guilt, alive and hungry. Steiner echoed these teachings, saying that the greatest danger of the inversion is not emotional chaos, but spiritual vulnerability. A person whose heart thinks becomes cold. A person whose mind feels becomes unstable. And when both happen at once, the individual loses the protective boundary that keeps their inner world intact. The first warning sign is subtle, a feeling that your own thoughts are too loud, not in volume, but in presence. They stand too close, breathe too near, as if they are no longer yours. Then comes the emotional bleed, sudden nostalgia for events that never happened, sudden despair with no clear source, sudden anxiety that feels borrowed. It's like seeing a reflection in a dark mirror and realizing it moved before you did. Steiner said that when this occurs, the soul begins to detach from its rightful seat, leaving the human being vulnerable to whatever forces crave control. And make no mistake, those forces always come. They arrive as impulses you can't trace, fears that appear without footsteps, desires that feel like they were implanted rather than born. You start acting out of instinct, but it isn't your instinct. You make decisions that feel logical, but the logic isn't yours. This is the moment Steiner described as the spiritual overshadowing, when the boundaries of the self become thin enough for the world's chaos to spill inside. If you've ever felt your emotions pulling your mind like a leash, or your thoughts suffocating your chest like a storm that never ends, you've touched the edge of this mystery. Most people run from it. Steiner wanted us to walk toward it, not out of curiosity, but out of survival, because understanding this inversion is the first step in reclaiming the inner throne before something else sits there. And this is only the opening door. Beyond it lies the mechanism itself, how consciousness fractures, how identity dissolves, and how forces disguised as intuition begin to guide your life. Imagine opening your eyes in a room you swear you've never entered, yet every object feels familiar, as if placed there by someone who knows your fears better than you do. That is how the fracture begins. Not with violence, but with recognition, a slow, creeping familiarity with something that should remain unknown. Steiner described this moment as the soft cracking of the inner mirror, a soundless event that reshapes the entire architecture of your consciousness. He warned that the danger is not the break itself, but what slips through the crack once it appears, because when consciousness splits, even slightly, the human being becomes two, the one who acts and the one who watches from the dark. The forbidden mechanism begins with pressure. Not physical pressure, but existential weight. A thought that refuses to leave. An emotion that grows teeth. A memory that follows you like a shadow that learned to walk. Under enough inner tension, the psyche performs a desperate maneuver. It creates a second space within you. A place where unbearable feelings are buried, where forbidden instincts are stored, where unresolved truths curl like serpents beneath the floorboards. Modern psychology calls this dissociation, but Steiner insisted it was something older, something far more metaphysical. He believed consciousness had layers, like the rings of an ancient tree, and when the inner self is overwhelmed, those rings separate, creating parallel currents of awareness. Picture a candle flame bending in two directions at the same time. One half tries to illuminate the world, the other half burns downward into the wax, devouring its own foundation. That is the split. The person continues to function, works, speaks, smiles, but somewhere inside, another version of them awakens. A quiet observer, a hidden recorder, a presence that feels like you, but also not you. Steiner said that this double is both protector and threat. It shields you from pain while slowly drawing energy away from your true self. And once awakened, it never sleeps again. Clinical records from Jung reveal cases that mirror this description with eerie precision. One patient, a young woman with a trembling voice and eyes always fixed on something over Jung's shoulder, claimed she could feel two streams of thought running through her head simultaneously. One voice whispered the logical narrative of her day. The other whispered what she called the deeper truth, a truth that terrified her. During sessions, Jung described the atmosphere growing dense, like the air itself was listening. She once told him, "I am watching myself talk to you." That phrase haunted him for months. It was as if her consciousness had been pushed out of its rightful place by an inner force too heavy to hold. Modern neuroscience reluctantly confirms pieces of Steiner's warnings. Brain imaging shows that under emotional overload, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, disconnects from the limbic system, creating two semi-independent states of awareness. One tries to analyze, the other tries to flee or fight or collapse. A human being becomes two systems battling for control under the same skull. Scientists describe it clinically, mechanically. Steiner described it spiritually, the soul momentarily separating from the mind, leaving the body to operate like a haunted machine. But ancient traditions saw this even earlier. In Hindu teachings, this split is called Dvaita, the becoming of two. In Christian mysticism, it is the shadow self, the unclaimed part of the soul that grows restless when ignored. Greek philosophers warned of the daimonic fracture, where reason and emotion lose their sacred alignment. All these traditions agreed on one point. The fracture is not random. It happens when the individual drifts too far from their inner center, when the mind speaks lies the heart cannot accept, or when the heart holds a truth the mind refuses to face. The warning signs of this split often feel like scenes from a psychological thriller. You feel emotional reactions that don't match the moment. You catch yourself thinking thoughts that seem planted by a stranger. You wake with a sense of déjà vu that tastes metallic in your mouth. You forget conversations you swear you never had. And sometimes, in the moment just before falling asleep, you feel a presence inside you shift its weight, like someone adjusting themselves in a chair. Steiner said this wasn't imagination, but the echo of consciousness stretching into two places at once. As the mechanism progresses, identity becomes unstable. The inner world becomes a house with two doors, both leading to rooms that contradict each other. And with contradiction comes vulnerability. External forces, stress, trauma, the emotional atmosphere of people around you begin to influence the split more easily than they should. The self becomes porous, permeable. Thoughts slip in from the outside. Emotions seep out from the inside. And slowly, the individual loses autonomy without even realizing it. This is why Steiner called the mechanism forbidden. Not because humans should never know about it, but because knowing does not guarantee control. The real risk is that once you see the fracture, you cannot unsee it. Once you feel the split, you cannot return to ignorance. And once your consciousness becomes two streams instead of one, the journey back to unity becomes a battle against the deepest forces within you. But within this darkness lies the next revelation. What happens when the split becomes visible, when the inner double steps forward and tries to take the lead? Imagine a man walking into a therapist's office as if crossing the threshold into another dimension, unaware that everything in him is about to be exposed. Jung described him with unsettling precision. Mid-40s, shoulders heavy as if carrying an invisible weight, and eyes that looked both terrified and strangely illuminated, as if he had seen something no human mind should ever hold. The room smelled of leather, ink, and faint smoke from Jung's pipe, but the man said he sensed something else, something metallic, like the scent of a storm trapped indoors. He claimed that his heart wasn't just beating, it was speaking. This man, whom Jung called the listener, said he first noticed the whisper during a night when the world felt hollow. He had been sitting alone, staring at a lamp that flickered for no reason when he felt a pulse inside his chest that didn't match his heartbeat. It was slower, colder, and each throb carried what he described as a meaning instead of a rhythm. He placed his hand over his chest, expecting panic, but instead felt clarity that terrified him. The whisper wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a sensation shaped like a sentence, a warning, a truth he had spent his life avoiding. In Jung's office, the man said, "My heart knows things my mind has hidden from me." Jung leaned forward, sensing the magnitude of what he was hearing. For Steiner, this would have been the moment the spiritual and the physiological intertwine, the forbidden crossing where the heart begins to think. Jung wrote that during the session the atmosphere thickened, until even his breathing felt heavier. The man's eyes widened, and he whispered, "It's happening now." His chest tightened, not in pain, but in revelation, and his pupils dilated as though seeing inward rather than outward. He said he felt his childhood shame rise from the depths of memory, not as images, but as bodily pulses. His heart told him he had betrayed himself at age 13. His heart told him he had loved a woman he'd never admitted caring for. His heart told him he had spent 30 years pretending to be strong so no one would notice he was drowning. Thought could not have spoken this way, only feeling could. But the feeling had taken on the structure of thought, forming meaning without language. Steiner insisted this inversion was not psychological disorder, but the soul trying to intervene when the ego lies too long. Modern neuroscience hesitates to approach experiences like these, but new studies from Cambridge show that the heart has its own neural network. Over 40,000 neurons capable of storing memory-like patterns. The body remembers, the heart reasons, and under emotional collapse, the brain's defenses weaken, allowing the heart's encoded experiences to surface with startling coherence. The listener wasn't hallucinating, he was decoding. But his suffering deepened when the inversion completed itself, the moment when not only the heart began to think, but the mind began to feel. He described it as a cold wave rising behind his forehead, carrying with it emotions that didn't belong to his consciousness. He felt grief that wasn't his, anger he didn't believe in, longing that tasted foreign. He said, "My mind is crying, doctor. Cease." Jung noted that the temperature of the room fell noticeably, as if the psyche had opened a doorway to some interior winter. Steiner warned that in this phase, the consciousness split becomes visible even to the person experiencing it. The listener felt two presences inside him, one standing behind his ribs whispering truths, the other hovering behind his eyes trembling with borrowed emotions. He said he could feel himself sliding between versions of himself like a ghost, shifting through walls. In ancient terms, he was confronting his daemon, the inner double formed by every abandoned truth and every denied fear. At the height of one session, he clutched the chair and whispered, "Something inside me is moving." Jung wrote that the words chilled him. The man said he felt a pressure against his chest, spreading upward until it reached his throat. He described it like a second heartbeat trying to break free. His voice shifted, subtly but unmistakably, becoming softer, deeper, almost like someone else was speaking through him. He said things he did not remember knowing. He confessed secrets he had never admitted aloud, and then he collapsed into silence, sweating, trembling, but strangely relieved. In that silence, Jung realized what Steiner had meant by the awakening of the inner witness, the moment when the soul stops watching from the shadows and steps forward. But awakening always comes with cost. The listener began experiencing dreams where he stood across from himself. In one dream, he said the other version smiled at him with a sadness too honest to bear. In another, the double placed a hand on his chest and said, "It's time to stop lying." He woke in tears with the sensation that someone had touched him. As weeks passed, his two awarenesses became synchronized. He said he no longer knew where thoughts ended and emotions began. He felt truths erupt from his chest and pain bloom inside his head like a frozen flower opening in reverse. He told Jung he feared losing his sanity, but feared even more losing the part of himself that had finally begun to speak. And that is the terrifying beauty Steiner described. When the heart whispers the truth, the soul tries to heal by force if necessary. But the healing feels like haunting, the integration feels like possession, and the truth feels like death before it feels like rebirth. What Jung and Steiner both knew, and what the listener discovered, is that once the inner witness awakens, the psychological world begins to shift around it. And this leads us to the next revelation, the scientific validation behind this haunting phenomenon, the cold, hard neuroscience behind the spiritual fracture. Imagine a laboratory at night, fluorescent lights humming with an artificial coldness, machines asleep in the half-dark, their metal frames catching reflections like thin blades. A graduate student working late notices something strange, an fMRI scan glowing with patterns no textbook ever dared to mention, a brain activating in regions that should not collaborate, logic centers lighting up at the same time as emotional cores, a dance of sparks that violates the known map of consciousness. She calls her professor. He stares at the screen, silent, then whispers, "This shouldn't be possible." But Steiner would have smiled, because he had predicted exactly this, the moment when modern science would stumble upon the spiritual mechanics of the human being. Accidentally, reluctantly, and too late to pretend ignorance, Neuroscience calls it cross-activation. Steiner called it the heart thinking through the mind. When emotional and rational circuits fire in synchrony, the brain behaves like a double instrument, tuning itself to a frequency that slips between the physical and the metaphysical. Harvard researchers noticed that when people confront painful truths, the vagus nerve, running from brain to heart, fires in a peculiar rhythm, sending data upward at faster rates than ever measured before, as if the heart were overriding the brain, as if the body were delivering a verdict the mind can no longer avoid. In one chilling study, subjects who recalled a memory they had hidden from themselves showed an inexplicable shift in brainwave pattern. The frontal lobe dimmed slightly, like someone turning down a lamp, while deeper structures flared with electricity, almost as if an inner presence awakened and pressed forward. The scientists wrote it clinically, depersonalization episodes. But the data told another story. A story Steiner had whispered decades before, that the soul intervenes when the personality tries too hard to bury its truths. Picture a person hooked to EEG electrodes, their breathing steady, their eyes closed. The machine beeps in steady rhythms until they remember a lie they have lived for years. Suddenly, the graph spikes with chaotic waves, then reorganizes into a pattern no one expected, a synchronized oscillation between heart-driven rhythms and cerebral frequencies. The heart sends signals that look like thoughts. The brain generates patterns that look like feelings. The two switch roles for a moment, revealing the forbidden mechanism not as myth, but as measurable fact. Steiner said that human consciousness is not contained in the brain alone, but radiates from the center of the chest, with the heart serving as an organ of perception. Modern research reluctantly agrees. The electromagnetic field of the heart is 60 times stronger than that of the brain, expanding several feet outside the body. It reacts milliseconds before the brain registers emotional stimuli. In controlled experiments, subjects unconsciously sensed future images before they appeared. Emotional ones triggered the heart first, then the brain, as if the heart had its own intuition, its own window into the unseen. This is why the listener, Jung's patient, felt truth pulsing in his chest. His heart remembered. His heart recognized. His heart spoke. The mind followed only afterward, overwhelmed by emotional content it could not logically digest. The result was inversion, a temporary collapse of the usual hierarchy. The soul pushing upward, the ego staggering backward, the organism reorganizing itself according to laws older than biology. Scientists resist this interpretation. They prefer terms like limbic override, somatic markers, predictive coding errors. But no terminology can mask the unsettling fact that the human organism behaves as if a deeper intelligence moves beneath the surface. When people undergo emotional revelation, their bodies vibrate, not metaphorically, but literally. Microtremors ripple through the chest. Electrical skin conductance spikes. Heart rhythms form fractal patterns. The body transitions into a state of heightened coherence, almost like meditation, but involuntary, forced by truth rather than serenity. Steiner would say, the soul is surfacing. Other studies reveal something even darker. During episodes of dissociation or emotional shock, moments when consciousness splits, the brain exhibits network switching, in which the default mode network shuts down and the salience network takes command. This is the moment the observer self awakens, and the witness Steiner described, the double that stands behind your thoughts and peers through your eyes. Subjects often report feeling watched from inside themselves, exactly as Jung's patient did. Ancient traditions recognized this intrusion long before EEG machines existed. Tibetan mystics warned that when the inner wind rises, it pushes the soul upward and the mind downward, creating a reversal that leads to visions, intuition, or madness. Kabbalists believe the heart contains the hidden intelligence, and when it activates, the person undergoes judgment from within. Greek initiates of Eleusis describe the moment of revelation as seeing oneself from outside, guided by a presence without a face. Science today hesitates to touch these parallels, but patterns are patterns, and the data speaks with a voice colder than any myth. When the heart awakens, it hijacks the brain. When the mind collapses, it absorbs emotional content like a sponge. And when both happen at once, the individual becomes a battleground of two intelligences, one biological, one spiritual. A person in this state feels things before knowing why, thinks things before choosing to, behaves with impulses that feel both foreign and inevitable. They describe moments where their body reacts before the mind approves, turning away from a person who appears friendly, stepping back from a situation that feels wrong, or crying over a memory they didn't know still lived inside them. These behaviors are not accidents. They are the soul intervening when the mind cannot bear the weight of its own dishonesty. Steiner believed that humanity would eventually reach a threshold where science and spirituality collide, violently, and consciousness becomes an exposed battlefield. Every experiment, every brain scan, every study of trauma, intuition, heart intelligence, and dissociation points toward that threshold. We are approaching it faster than anyone expected. And when the invisible becomes measurable, When the spiritual becomes neurological, one truth emerges like a shadow stepping into the light. The human being is not one thing, it is many, and the forces inside us are preparing to reveal themselves. The next step of the descent is older than science, older than modern psychology, older than history itself. To understand what wakes inside us during the split, we must turn to the ancient doctrines, the lost teachings, the inner temples that saw this mechanism long before we did. Imagine entering a stone chamber illuminated only by a single flame, a flame that refuses to flicker even though the air is thick with cold. This is how the ancient mystery schools describe the beginning of initiation, an encounter not with an external teacher, but with the silent being that lives behind your thoughts. The Egyptians called it the double of light. The Greeks knew it as the daemon. The early Christians whispered about the inner man. Steiner simply called it the true self and insisted that every human being carries inside them a temple, an invisible sanctuary where knowledge is stored not in words but in vibrations. It is this temple that awakens when the heart begins to think and the mind begins to feel. To understand the fracture of consciousness, the ancient orders didn't use psychology or experiments. They used ritual. They believed that whenever a person lies to themselves, betrays their purpose, or abandons their inner truth, a veil drops across the entrance of this inner temple. The veil grows with each denial, and when it grows too thick, the soul begins to suffocate behind it. That suffocation is what modern science calls anxiety, dissociation, depression. But ancient initiates knew better. They said, the temple darkens when the self forgets its origin. In the Eleusinian mysteries, novices were told to walk blindfolded into complete darkness, guided only by priests who spoke in cryptic verses, but the true test happened inside, not in the physical corridors. Initiates experienced waves of fear, strange visions, moments of internal collapse. Their heartbeats would accelerate, then slow, then accelerate again, as if responding to a conversation happening beyond the reach of hearing. Ancient texts describe this moment with disturbing clarity. The heart sees, the mind listens. This was the ancient recognition of the inversion we have already witnessed in Jung's patient, the heart acting like a brain, and the brain receiving emotion like an open wound. Other ancient orders described even more chilling events. Tibetan monks during the practice of Chod intentionally summoned the inner demons, not supernatural creatures, but the parts of the self that had been rejected, silenced, or split away. These monks knew the psyche fractures under pressure, but instead of fleeing, they walked toward the fracture. They invited the double, the shadow, the wounded self, and treated it as a teacher rather than a threat. Steiner admired this practice because it matched his own understanding. The inner temple becomes active when what scares you the most is finally acknowledged. In Kabbalistic teachings, the heart is called Tiferet, the balance point between the upper world of wisdom and the lower world of instinct. When Tiferet collapses, when the heart thinks in fear instead of love, the entire spiritual structure distorts. The psyche splits, the self divides, and forces that should remain dormant begin to stir. These teachings say that the soul has rooms, each holding aspects of one's destiny, memory, and virtue. When we ignore these rooms, they fill with shadows. When we return to them, they burst with radiant fire. The lost doctrine of the inner temple teaches that every human being is a universe under reconstruction. Steiner believed these ancient metaphors were not symbolic. They were literal descriptions of spiritual anatomy. He said the human soul has chambers, corridors, thresholds, and guardian forces. When the heart and mind reverse their roles, these chambers begin to shift, rearrange, and sometimes collapse. People feel this collapse as panic, confusion, compulsions, or sudden intuitive visions. Ancient priests saw this as the soul knocking on the walls of its own forgotten house. The warning signs of a collapsing inner temple appear like scenes from an ancient drama. First comes the trembling, a subtle quiver in the chest or hands. Then the sense of being watched from inside yourself, as if an unseen statue in the temple has begun to open its eyes. Then come the dreams, corridors, mirrors, staircases descending into rooms you do not recognize. People report hearing footsteps behind them in dreams, even though they walk alone. Ancient texts interpret this as the soul trying to reunite with its scattered pieces. The ancient orders also taught stages of descent. In the first stage, the initiate feels disorientation, the dissolving of the familiar world. In the second, the emotional tides rise uncontrollably, flooding the mind. In the third, the witness self emerges, the inner observer who has been silent for years. And in the fourth stage, the shadow steps forward, not to destroy, but to reunify. This mirrors the psychological stages seen in modern trauma research: fragmentation, emotional overflow, depersonalization, emergence of the observer, and eventual integration. Yet the ancient version understood something science still hesitates to accept: that this process is not only neurological but spiritual. These doctrines were not meant for everyone. That is why they were hidden, encrypted, guarded. Because once you awaken the inner temple, you cannot return to who you were. You become responsible for the truth you discover. The Greeks warned that no man sees the light of Eleusis and remains unchanged. The Egyptians said that who enters the sanctuary leaves a different soul behind. Steiner echoed this stern warning: To awaken the inner temple is to awaken the destiny you have avoided. Modern people dismiss these teachings as myth, but the symptoms remain, the fractures remain, the awakening remains. Something inside the human being is trying to rise, an ancient intelligence older than the brain and deeper than emotion. And as the heart and mind continue their forbidden inversion, this intelligence is pushed closer and closer to the surface. But with every awakening comes danger, because before the soul reunifies, before the temple is restored, the shadows within it begin to move, and they speak in the only language they know, warning. It begins quietly, always quietly. Not with a scream, not with a vision, not with a collapse. The first warning arrives like a subtle tremor inside the chest, the kind you almost mistake for a change in breathing. But it isn't breathing. It's movement, a shifting inside the inner temple, a stirring of something you buried hoping it would die. Steiner said the earliest signs of inner danger are the easiest to ignore because they mimic ordinary life. A tightening in the throat, a heaviness behind the eyes, a sudden memory that flickers and vanishes before you can grasp it. These are the murmurs, the whispers the abyss sends before it steps closer. Imagine walking through your house at night and hearing soft footsteps, yet knowing no one is there. That is what the psyche feels when the shadow begins to approach. The footsteps echo in the soul long before they reach the mind. People report strange sensations, a chill moving across the spine, a pressure in the ribs, a feeling that their thoughts have gained weight. Some feel their heartbeats taking on strange rhythms, as if tapping out a message they cannot decode. These are not coincidences. They are warnings, messages carried by the same inner mechanics scientists still struggle to map. Steiner taught that when the heart begins to think, it senses truth long before the mind acknowledges it. The first warning is always emotional, a discomfort that makes no sense, a fear without a cause, or a sadness that appears like a fog with no weather to explain it. In modern terms, this is the limbic system firing before the cortex understands what is happening, but from a spiritual perspective, it is the soul ringing a bell inside its forgotten temple, urging you to return before the structure collapses completely. Then come the visual distortions, not hallucinations, but subtleties, patterns in the corner of the eye, shadows that seem to move a fraction too slowly, reflections that appear slightly delayed. Jung called these micro-perceptions, the psyche's attempt to communicate through symbolic glitching. Ancient mystics believed these distortions meant the veil between inner and outer worlds was thinning. Steiner said they were the first cracks in the psychic mirror, revealing echoes of the self that usually stay hidden. The next warning arrives through memory. You begin recalling events you haven't thought about in decades, some painful, some trivial, some so vivid they feel like they happened yesterday. But the memories come without context, without sequence, like scenes from a film that has been cut apart and reshuffled. Modern research shows this happens when the brain starts reorganizing stored emotional data, preparing for integration. Ancient teachings saw it as the soul gathering its scattered fragments. Either way, it signals that your inner world is shifting. But the most unsettling warning sign is the feeling of being observed from within. People describe it differently. A presence watching behind the eyes, a second awareness hovering just behind the mind, a quiet witness standing in the shadows of thought. This is the emergence of the inner double, the same double that appeared in Jung's patient. Steiner insisted this presence is not an intruder, but the part of you that has remained untouched by your own lies. When it finally steps forward, its gaze is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it sees everything you hide. Liberating because it refuses to let you continue wearing the mask that is killing you. As the warnings intensify, the body begins to react. Hands tremble slightly. Sleep becomes unpredictable. Dreams turn symbolic. Staircases descending into darkness. Mirrors that reveal unfamiliar faces. Doorways that open into endless corridors. Ancient mystery schools said these dreams were the soul's language, the temple speaking through imagery. Neuroscience describes them as the brain's attempt to reconcile dissonant psychological material. But both interpretations agree on one core truth. Something is happening inside you, something irreversible. There's also the phenomenon of emotional bleed, where emotions leak into the wrong moments. You feel anger during a calm conversation. You feel joy while remembering something tragic. You feel grief in the middle of a peaceful afternoon. These are not mood swings. They are the shadow pushing its buried content into the conscious mind. The psyche is rearranging itself under pressure, forcing long-suppressed truths to rise like ghosts from the floorboards. Then comes the stillness, the eerie calm that appears before a psychological storm. People describe it as a moment where time feels thick, where sounds grow distant, where the world looks slightly dimmer. This is the threshold, the moment just before the inner descent accelerates. In ancient rites, initiates entered this stage before confronting the shadows within their temple. Steiner called it the silent crossing, the point where the soul prepares to reveal its truth with ruthless clarity. The warnings are never random. They follow a sequence, a progression that mirrors both spiritual initiation and psychological breakdown. First the tremor, then the distortions, then the memories, then the watcher, and finally, the stillness. Once the stillness arrives, there is no turning back. The temple has awakened. The shadow has stepped forward. The descent has begun. And descent is the only path to integration. But what comes next is darker, heavier, more dangerous. Because once the warnings end, the phenomenon gathers strength. It evolves, deepens, and begins to act with intention. In the next topic, we enter the stages of this descent, how the shadow forms, how it grows, and how it tries to take control. The descent never begins with chaos. It begins with precision, an eerie, calculated shift inside you, as if an unseen hand has reached into your inner temple and turned a key you didn't know existed. At first, the world feels only slightly off, like a painting hung 1 inch too low. But then the strangeness grows. You feel a quiet pressure building behind your thoughts, as if another intelligence were slowly rising through the layers of your consciousness. Steiner warned that this is the moment when the shadow stops whispering and begins to move with intention. It stops being a presence. It becomes a force. The first stage of descent is infiltration. The shadow enters your emotional field, not violently, but with a kind of gentle inevitability. You start experiencing feelings that do not match your reality. Rage that appears without provocation, sadness that washes over you like cold rain, or sudden nostalgia for moments that did not happen the way you remember them. Neuroscience calls this emergent affective material, but Steiner called it what it truly is: the shadow reclaiming what belongs to it. Emotions you refuse to feel. Truths you refuse to see. Memories you buried so deeply they no longer have edges. Then comes the second stage, alignment. This is where the mind and the shadow begin to synchronize. Thoughts become sharper, but colder. You begin thinking with a clarity that feels unnatural, almost predatory. The heart grows distant, numb, as if retreating into silence. People in this stage often describe a sense of detachment from their actions, as though someone else were choosing their words just a heartbeat before they speak them. Jung noticed this in multiple patients. Their tone would shift, their posture would change, even their vocabulary would alter subtly, revealing a pattern too consistent to dismiss. During alignment, dreams intensify. You no longer wander through symbolic corridors. You are confronted. A figure appears in these dreams, sometimes familiar, sometimes faceless, always watching. This figure does not chase you, it waits. Because the shadow does not hunt. It knows the psyche will come to it eventually. The figure stands in the center of your dream like a truth you have run from for years, patient and unblinking. Ancient rites referred to this entity as the guardian of the threshold. Steiner insisted it was not a demon, but a mirror, one that reflects everything you refuse to admit about yourself. Then comes the third stage, overtaking. This is when the descent becomes dangerous. The shadow, no longer confined to memory or emotion, begins influencing behavior. You say things you regret, but they feel inevitable. You act impulsively and wonder who inside you gave the command. It feels like walking beside yourself, watching your body move through the world with a will you cannot fully claim. Modern psychology calls this fragmented executive function, but this clinical phrasing hides the horror. Part of you has stepped out of the driver's seat. Another part has taken the wheel. During overtaking, the body reacts violently. Heart rate spikes unexpectedly. Muscles tense without trigger. Breathing becomes shallow. This is the somatic signature of descent. The heart tries to reclaim its position as the seat of truth. The mind tries to resist the emotional flood. And the shadow stands between them, pulling their conflict into itself like a vortex. Then comes the fourth stage, expansion. The shadow grows. It begins influencing not only your inner world, but your perception of the outer one. Colors look duller. Silence feels heavier. Faces become harder to read. You sense hostility that may or may not be real. The world starts echoing your inner state, just as ancient mystics warned. They believe that once the inner temple cracks, the outer world becomes a reflection of that fracture. You begin seeing symbolic patterns everywhere. Numbers, repeated phrases, coincidences that feel intentional. These are not delusions. They are the psyche trying to communicate through the only language it has left, synchronicity. Steiner said expansion is the phase where the shadow attempts to integrate itself fully, where the double steps forward as if to say, I am you, you are me. Let us stop pretending otherwise. People often describe feeling like they are shedding a version of themselves. A phantom identity collapses, a false self dies, and the shadow for a moment appears almost compassionate, offering a truth so honest it hurts to look at it. But the final stage is the one most fear, submission. This is not possession, it is surrender. You realize the descent cannot be stopped. The shadow does not want to destroy you. It wants to merge with you. It wants to give the heart its voice back and the mind its clarity. But before that integration can happen, it strips away everything that protects you from your own truth. Every lie, every excuse, every denial, this stripping feels like annihilation. People break down. They sob without knowing why. They shake. They collapse inward. They experience moments of ego death, not mystical bliss, but raw psychological exposure. In ancient rites, this was the moment initiates cried out or fell unconscious. In modern therapy, it is the moment patients stare blankly at the floor when they realize the truth they've avoided for decades. Steiner called it the night of the soul, a darkness so complete it feels absolute. But in this darkness, something happens. The heart begins to warm again. The mind begins to quiet. The breath deepens. A faint sense of order, fragile but real, starts to return. Because submission is not the end. It is the preparation. The psyche collapses so the soul can rise. And as the shadow settles into its rightful place, something else awakens. Something not individual, but collective. Because the descent does not happen to one person alone. It affects everyone around them. Families, groups, societies. The shadow never descends alone. Once awakened inside a single person, it radiates outward like a silent heat spreading through a room with no source. Steiner warned that the human psyche is not isolated within the skull. It exists in a field, a web, a living atmosphere we all inhale, and when one person's inner temple cracks, the fractures don't stop at their skin. They spread, first to the people who stand closest, then to the ones they think about, and sometimes, most disturbingly, to entire communities. It begins with emotional resonance. Someone undergoing descent enters a room and the air changes. People feel uneasy, even if they don't know why. A subtle tension coiling in the chest, a flicker of irritation, a heaviness in the gaze. Modern psychology calls it emotional contagion. Ancient mystics called it possession at a distance. Steiner called it the field of shared consciousness. When the heart thinks and the mind feels, the distortions inside a single human being create a ripple in this field, pulling others into its gravity. The first stage of collective influence is mirroring. Those around the descending individual begin adopting their emotional frequency. They become anxious without cause, irritable without reason. Some even experience dreams that echo the other person's struggles, dreams of wandering through collapsing temples or being watched by faceless figures. Married couples report sharing nightmares. Families experience synchronized tension. Friends begin having the same intrusive thoughts. These are not coincidences. They are transmissions. The psyche broadcasts. In ancient Greece, priests of Eleusis warned initiates not to undergo descent around the unprepared, for their inner storm could trigger storms in others. In Tibetan monasteries, practitioners were isolated during shadow work to prevent psychic bleeding. In early Christian texts, the Desert Fathers described demonic trials that spread from monk to monk through proximity alone. Today, neuroscience observes similar patterns in group trauma. When one individual fractures, the brain waves of those around them begin to shift in matching rhythms, especially in theta and gamma frequencies. The shadow can propagate. Then comes the second stage, field distortion. This is when the environment itself begins reflecting the inner conflict. Conversations become tense, small arguments erupt, misunderstandings multiply, technology malfunctions, objects are misplaced, pets behave strangely, light flickers more often, people feel watched, some feel dizzy or strangely cold near the descending individual. Modern science cannot explain this, but quantum biology hints at the possibility that human emotion affects electromagnetic fields far more than previously believed. Steiner went further. He insisted that when a person's heart-brain field becomes destabilized, it distorts the collective atmosphere, making it easier for other people's shadows to rise. This is why emotional crises often happen in clusters, why families collapse at the same time, why entire friend groups spiral together, why societies fall into waves of fear, violence, fanaticism, or despair, as if possessed by a single invisible spirit. The third stage is collective amplification. Once the group field is destabilized, shadow traits multiply. One person's suppressed rage triggers another's suppressed jealousy. A third person's forgotten grief awakens. A fourth person's insecurity erupts. It becomes a chain reaction, each individual's inner temple shaking the next. In extreme cases, communities behave like a single organism overtaken by its darkest impulses. This has occurred throughout history. Witch hunts, mass hysteria, political fanaticism, cult psychology, and dangerous ideologies spreading like wildfire. Steiner said these events were not random. They were expressions of a collective entity, the egregore, a self-sustaining psychic force created by the combined emotions of a group. Once born, it begins to feed on fear, anger, and division, steering the group like a puppeteer guiding many strings. Modern sociology observes similar patterns in mob mentality. Neuroscience notes that mirror neurons fire in synchrony during group panic. But the ancient view is more chilling. The shadow of many can merge into one. The fourth stage of collective descent is archetypal manifestation. At this point, individuals in the group begin exhibiting behaviors that match mythological patterns. The betrayer, the victim, the accuser, the martyr, the tyrant, the savior. It's as if ancient roles awaken within them, roles older than their personal identity. Jung described this as activation of the collective unconscious, primordial scripts that play out whenever a group's psychic field becomes unstable. Steiner saw it as spiritual forces, seizing the opportunity to express themselves through human vessels. In families, this stage can look like repeating cycles of conflict that no one can explain. In workplaces, it appears as sudden polarization or paranoia. In society, it emerges as mass delusion, times when entire populations behave irrationally. guided by fear, projection, and unconscious forces. These moments are not historical accidents, they are psychological eruptions. Finally comes the fifth stage, the possession of the field. This is when the shadow of the individual becomes indistinguishable from the shadow of the group. Everyone begins feeding the same emotional vortex. Everyone participates in the same distortion. Everyone feels trapped in a story they didn't choose. At this point, the collective behaves like a single mind, a dark, wounded, confused intelligence searching for catharsis. In ancient rites, this stage required intervention by a master or priest to reset the field. Today, therapists, mediators, spiritual teachers, and even certain leaders try to act in this role, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously. But Steiner believed the real solution begins inside the individual. Because the shadow cannot be driven out of the group unless it is first faced within the self. This is why dissent is not doom, it is preparation. Because what comes next, the protocol of protection, is the only barrier between a human being and total psychological collapse. It is the survival strategy, the spiritual armor, the inner sword. There comes a moment in every descent when the world feels thinner, as if the walls between thought and reality have loosened their grip. A moment when you know, without being told, that you cannot continue as you are. The shadow has awakened, the inner temple has cracked, and the collective field around you has begun to vibrate with energies you no longer fully control. This is the threshold Steiner warned about, the point where the human being must choose between fragmentation and awakening. And that is where the survival protocol begins. An ancient method disguised as instinct, a set of psychological and spiritual maneuvers designed to protect the self when all internal structures start to collapse. The first element of this protocol is consciousness as a shield. Not awareness, not mindfulness, not self-help introspection. Consciousness, raw, unfiltered presence. A sudden tightening of attention that freezes the inner field and prevents the shadow from overtaking it. Steiner said the human I, the true self, is the only force capable of stopping a psychological descent from becoming possession. When you pull yourself fully into the present moment, through breath, through grounding, through a sharp internal command, you create a wall the shadow cannot cross. Jung taught his patients the same technique without naming it. Look the feeling in the eye. Face it directly. Do not flinch, because the shadow feeds on avoidance. It dissolves in presence. The second element is what Steiner called the immediate boundary. This is not emotional distance, it is an act of inner survival. When the psyche fractures and the field around you becomes distorted, you must draw a fast, uncompromising line. You must tell yourself, not this, not now, not here. Boundaries during descent are not polite. They are violent, they are primal. They are a refusal to let someone else's darkness fuse with your own. This may mean stepping out of a room, ending a conversation, shutting down a trigger, or refusing to engage in emotional contagion. Ancient initiates wore protective amulets. Modern initiates must build psychological armor. The third element is strategic withdrawal. In ancient rites, initiates were isolated during the most dangerous phases of descent, not because they were weak, but because the field around them was too open, too porous, too vulnerable. Steiner insisted that withdrawal is not escape, it is recalibration. It gives the inner temple space to rebuild its walls. When the psyche is overwhelmed, solitude becomes medicine, silence becomes a shield, stillness becomes a sword. In the modern world, this means turning off the noise, breaking contact with destabilizing people, retreating into a controlled environment where your emotions cannot be hijacked by the collective shadow. Then comes the fourth element, naming the force. This is one of the most ancient protective acts. Every mystery school, from Egypt to Tibet to Greece, believed that naming a force strips it of its power. When you name the feeling, the thought, the impulse, the fear, you drag it into the light. You stop it from growing in your blind spots. Jung called this objectifying the unconscious. Steiner called it making the invisible visible. If you cannot name what is taking hold of you, it will grow teeth in the dark. But when you say, this is fear, this is abandonment, this is rage, this is grief, this is the double, this is the shadow, the force weakens, its outline becomes clear, and clarity is the first step toward dominance. The fifth element is anchoring the breath. Breath is not physiology, it is architecture. It is scaffolding holding your psyche together. When the descent intensifies, your breath fractures. Shallow, fast, erratic. This opens the door wider for the shadow. But when you breathe slowly, deeply, rhythmically, the entire nervous system reorganizes itself. The brain calms, the heart stabilizes, the psyche regains control. Steiner warned that breath is the bridge between body and soul. If the bridge collapses, the descent deepens. But if you reinforce the bridge, you regain the ability to cross between shadow and self without falling. The sixth element is redirecting perception. During descent, the mind becomes hypnotized by the shadow. Thoughts spiral. Fear amplifies, paranoia grows. To survive, you must seize control of your attention, forcefully. Look at a fixed point, engage your senses, focus on something external and stable. This breaks the trance, restores perspective. It brings the self back into the body. Ancient monks used bells, mantras, and candles for this reason. Modern psychology uses sensory grounding. The method is the same. Reclaim the spotlight of awareness before the shadow steals it. Then comes the seventh element, reintegrating the heart. The inversion cannot be undone unless the heart is restored to its throne. You must listen, not to the panic, but to the deeper pulse beneath it. When the heart begins to think, it reveals truths you can no longer ignore. You must face those truths, no matter how painful. Otherwise, the shadow will hold them hostage. Reintegration requires courage. The courage to feel what you have avoided, to admit what you have denied, to forgive what you have buried. The heart does not heal through avoidance. It heals through revelation. The eighth element is calling the witness. This is the higher self, the inner watcher, the part of you that does not break even when everything else collapses. It is the guardian of the inner temple. When you summon it, through intention, through memory, through inner silence, you activate the spiritual intelligence that holds your psyche together. Steiner said the witness is the closest thing humans have to divinity. Jung said the same with different words, the self. When the witness steps forward, the shadow steps back. Finally comes the ninth and most dangerous element, holding the line. This is where most people fail. Once the shadow retreats, even slightly, the psyche demands relief. But you cannot collapse. You must maintain the boundary, sustain the breath, keep the witness awake, reinforce the inner temple. The descent may last hours, days, weeks. It tests endurance, not strength. The protocol is not a single act. It is a stance, a posture of survival you must hold until the psyche rebalances. Once the line is held long enough, something extraordinary happens. The shadow stops fighting. It begins listening. It begins softening. It begins returning to its rightful place, not as an enemy, but as a part of you that has finally been acknowledged. And that leads us to the final turn of the journey, the philosophical climax, the moment when the truth behind all this darkness finally reveals itself. There comes a moment, after the descent, after the warnings, after the confrontation with the shadow, when everything falls silent. Not the soft silence of a quiet room, but the immense cosmic silence that echoes inside the chest like the aftermath of an earthquake. It is the silence that follows the collapse of illusions, the silence that rises when every mask has been burned away, the silence that marks the boundary between who you thought you were and the one who has been waiting beneath your skin for years, lifetimes, maybe centuries. Steiner said this silence is the threshold where the soul finally turns around and looks back at you. The final revelation does not arrive with lightning or revelation. It arrives like a slow exhale from the depths of your own being. Your breath steadies, your chest warms, your thoughts soften, not because you are calm, but because the inner battle has ended. The shadow is no longer an intruder. It has returned to its place in the architecture of the psyche. The temple has been rebuilt from the inside out. And now, standing where the shadow once stood is something older, clearer, more luminous. Steiner described it as the inner sun. Jung called it the self. Ancient mystics called it the divine spark. It is the presence that has watched every moment of your life from the quiet edge of your consciousness, waiting for the moment when the heart and mind would finally stop pretending to be separate. This presence does not judge. It does not accuse. It does not demand. It simply reveals. It reveals what you are, not what you show, not what you fear, not what you hide, but what you are. The final revelation unfolds in stages, though these stages happen in a single, seamless experience. First comes the recognition that the shadow was never your enemy. It was the part of you that held the truths you were too afraid to face. The shadow was the guardian of your abandoned emotions, your forgotten memories, your silenced instincts. It was not darkness. It was depth. It was not evil. It was unclaimed power. When you accept this, the shadow stops hiding behind fear and steps into its rightful role as your inner protector. The second stage is the return of the heart. After the inversion, after the emotional storms, after the collapse of familiar patterns, the heart resumes its ancient function, not as a passive organ, but as the center of awareness. Its intelligence becomes clear. You feel truths before you understand them. You sense direction before thought forms. The heart begins to speak with the authority Steiner described, not through emotion, but through resonance, through recognition, through presence. It becomes the throne of your being once again. Then comes the third stage, the cleansing of the mind. This is not the mind becoming empty, but the mind becoming honest. Thoughts no longer twist themselves to avoid discomfort. The mental fog lifts. The intrusive spirals dissolve. The mind becomes sharp, lucid, obedient not to fear, but to truth. It returns to its rightful role, not as a tyrant over the heart, but as its instrument, a blade guided by a deeper hand. In this state, something extraordinary happens. The witness becomes permanent. The higher self, which appeared intermittently during the descent, now stands at the center of your awareness. It becomes the one who breathes, the one who chooses, the one who sees. You no longer react, you respond. You no longer drown in emotion. You read it like a message. You no longer fear your inner world. You navigate it like a master walking through their own temple. And this is when the soul finally looks back at you. It is said that when this happens, the individual becomes twice born, a concept found in Egypt and India and ancient Greece and the early Christian mysteries. Everything inside you aligns. The heart thinks with wisdom. The mind feels with empathy. The double becomes integrated. The shadow becomes an ally. And the soul, no longer buried beneath layers of denial and fear, rises like a dawn inside your chest. But the final revelation carries a darker truth, one that Steiner insisted must never be softened. Once you see the soul, you can never again pretend you are not responsible for it. You cannot return to ignorance. You cannot unknow who you are. You cannot hide the truth from yourself ever again. People who try to return to their old life after witnessing the inner sun often experience profound discomfort, because the old identity no longer fits. The masks itch. The lies taste bitter. The roles feel artificial. Once the soul has revealed itself, the human being must live differently, or collapse again even more violently. This is the price of awakening. And yet, there's also a gift, a quiet, steady gift that feels like standing in the center of a storm and realizing the storm answers to you. You feel grounded in your own presence. The world no longer manipulates your inner weather. The collective field may shake, but you do not. You become a stabilizing force for others, a quiet beacon, a silent mirror, a person whose inner temple radiates calm instead of fracture. Steiner believed this state was the destiny of humanity, a future where every human being would unite the mind and heart, shadow and self, body and soul, a future where consciousness would no longer be a battlefield but a kingdom. And so the final revelation is both terrifying and liberating. The darkness you feared was not an enemy. It was the doorway to the one watching from within. And now that it has opened, the watcher will never leave you again. The soul has looked back, and you are finally whole.